Once upon a time, the words that started every fairy tale and bedtime story when I was a kid, and I'm sure it was for many of you as well. There were so many stories of princesses, witches, giants, and anything you could possibly imagine. There were such sweet stories that ended with everyone being happy. But do any of you know where these stories actually came from? We have two German brothers to thank for these stories. But these stories that we know today are a little different than the original Grimm Brothers stories. Let's start by looking into the lives of the Grimm brothers. I got this information from librarypoint.org. They were born in Hanau, Germany. Jacob was born in 1785, and his younger brother Wilhelm was born in 1786. The two brothers were inseparable their entire lives. Although they were best friends, they had different personalities. Jacob was shy and introverted, and Wilhelm, the younger brother, was outgoing and extroverted. Their father died when Jacob was just 11 years old. And since he was the eldest son, he was expected to be the man of the house, which is a lot to put on an 11-year-old kid. The family knew that the boys were smart and could benefit from more schooling, so they sent them to Lyceum High School. At first, it was hard for the brothers. Most of the students there came from well-off families and had better schooling than they had had thus far. But they worked hard and eventually caught up. When they graduated, their mother wanted them to go to college for law school. Jacob, being the oldest, applied first. He applied to the University of Marburg, but he was declined. You see, there were so many students applying to this school that no matter how good of grades you had, unless you were in the top 7 levels of society, you didn't get in, which was the case for Jacob, whose family was in the 8th level of society. But their mother wrote the school for an exception, and they granted it, and Jacob went. This was extremely hard on Wilhelm. It was the first time the brothers had ever been separated. Shortly after Jacob went to college, Wilhelm became very ill, and he didn't leave his room for 6 months. When he finally returned to school, not only had he caught up to the rest of his class, he had surpassed them. He had learned more in 6 months than most students do in a year. And then he ended up going and joining his brother at the university. The next year, one of Jacob's favorite professors was doing research in Paris at their National Library. And his teacher had called him and asked him to be his assistant. But this required Jacob to be away from school for a year, but his family allowed it. When he returned, he started working at the War Office, but the French soon took over and it became the French War Office. He continued working there until he heard of a better job at the Royal Library. You see, the King and Queen had 12,000 books in their library, but no desire to read them. The only other people allowed to read the books was the librarian, Jacob, and his assistant, Wilhelm. They started reading through all these books and trying to gather up all the German folklore they could, and they went around and got stories from common people. They did all this to try and preserve their German heritage, and they published their first book in 1812. These stories aren't the bedtime stories we are used to. Their original stories weren't meant for kids. They were meant for scholars, such as themselves. The story I'm going to tell you came from the brothers' book. It's called Ashbel, but most of you will recognize it by Cinderella. A lot of the storyline's the same. Her mother dies, and her father marries this awful stepmom with 2 terrible stepdaughters. But the father doesn't die in this story. They planted a tree in the garden where they buried her mother, and Cinderella would go out there and sit and talk to her mother, and a bird made its nest there, and she would talk to this bird, and it would give her things that she would need. She found out that there was going to be a ball thrown by the king, and on the 3rd night of this ball, the prince would pick a bride. She wanted to go so badly, but her stepmother wouldn't let her. So she went out to the tree and asked the bird to get her something to wear so she could go, and it did. She went to the ball, and all night the prince only danced with her. As it got later, she went home and ran off, and the prince couldn't catch up. The 3rd night, she left her shoe, and the prince found her. He knew what house she was in, but didn't know which daughter it was. So he asked the father, "Can your daughters try on this shoe?" The oldest daughter tried on the shoe, but her toe was too big. So her mother gave her a knife and chopped it off so it would fit. So as they rode away together, they rode past the tree, and the bird said, back again, look to the shoe. The shoe is too small and not made for you. Prince, prince, look for thy bride, for she's not the true one that sits by thy side. So he looked at the shoe, and he noticed the blood, and he took her back to the house. And he had the next daughter try on the shoe, but her heel was too big. So the mother shoved it on until her foot bled. But they rode away with the prince, and once again the bird said, back again, look to the shoe. The shoe is too small and not made for you. Prince, prince, look again for thy bride, for she's not the one that sits by thy side. So he looked at their shoe, and that's when he noticed her stocking was red with blood. So he took her back to the house and asked the father, do you have any more daughters? And he said, oh, just one, but it's from my first wife. It couldn't be her. But the prince insisted. And so Cinderella tried on the shoe, and when they rode away together, the bird said, home, home, look at the shoe. Princess, the shoe was made for you. Prince, prince, take home thy bride, for she is the true one that sits by thy side. There are some stories today that are going back to the original Grimm stories. One of those movies is Into the Woods. And here's a clip of them cutting the toe off of the eldest sister.
Ants.
Careful, my toe!
Darling, I know!
What'll we do?
We'll have to go, but when you're his bride, you can sit or ride. You'll never need to walk!
It's crazy to think that the fairy tales we all know and love started out as a way to preserve the German heritage. And I think it's safe to say that the Grimm brothers successfully handled that mission. Who knew from such grim beginnings that you could get a happily ever after?